Hi, I'm Selena. Welcome to my September Classics wrap-up. So technically I've already filmed this, and just letting you know if the lighting seems different, warmer, oranger, if it looks weird, it's because I have had to turn on my lamps because it is later than I wanted to filming this video. And I've actually already filmed this video, but it was too dark, so we're refilming it again. So if you're unaware of what a classics wrap-up is, this is just something I've been doing where I talk about the classics that I read each month separately from the rest of the books I read each month, because I do read a significant amount of classics, both because I like them, but also because I'm an English major, and so I read a lot of books for school, and I just figure, why not talk about them? And so this month is especially large because I've been reading a lot of classics for one of my classes, really short classics, for one of my classes about the fantasy genre, sort of, and its evolution. And so we have been looking at some of the classic origins of fantasy, so we're going to talk about some of those, and then we're also going to talk about the two books that I have chosen to pick up on my own that are classics. And one of those I am just going to do a quick shout out to because I am still currently reading it, but I should have it done by the end of the month. I just need to film this so I can get this up in a timely manner. I want to get this up Tuesday. You should be watching this Tuesday. And hopefully I will finish this by the end of the month, but I'm not done now. And so I will talk about this more in the actual wrap-up, but I do want to just mention it here in the classics wrap-up because it is a classic that I'm reading this month. It's just not done yet, and that is Fellowship of the Ring. This is the first in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I am really liking this book a lot. I'm only 96 pages into it, and I don't want to give you any thoughts or impressions really because the plot hasn't even really started at this point, and so this will just be one that I tell you I'm currently reading. I'm really enjoying it. I don't anticipate this book being lower than a 4-star, but you'll find out my actual rating and my thoughts in the regular wrap-up. And so if you're watching when the wrap-up's already up, I'll have that linked in the cards, but if you're not, you'll catch it Thursday or Friday. So Fellowship is the 9th classic that I'm working on this month. I've already completed 8 classics. Don't worry, they're pretty short, and I actually had to read them for school, so like that was keeping me on track here. As far as genres go, I read 2 short stories, 3 poems, technically, 1 play, and 2 novels. Yes, not including the novel that I just showed you, Lord of the Rings. And then whittling those genres down even further, the 2 short stories that I read were both fairy tales or folk tales. The poems that I read were all Arthurian romances, and so some of them look more like poems than others. And then the play was a tragedy. And then as for the novels that aren't Lord of the Rings, because Fellowship is fantasy, the novels that I read are Comedy of Manners and a detective mystery fiction novel or novella, either one. And so yes, that is 8 classics that I've already finished and 1 that I'm working on. Now let's get into the 8 that I've already finished. Now that I've mentioned all the genres, all the things, let's get into it. Most of these I gave 3 stars, but I did have a 4-star and a 5-star. Getting into the first classic that I finished this month, I first finished Aladdin and the Enchanted Lamp. So this is a folktale, fairy tale thing that is supposedly from 1001 Nights, and from as far as I know, this is not in the original or one of the original manuscripts of 1001 Nights. This was added later, or it has a different author than the rest, and so it's kind of disputed about whether it is kind of a legitimate 1001 Nights tale, but I don't really know too much about that side of things. That's just what I learned in class, so I'm just repeating that back to you. On my thoughts on this, this is the story that all of the Aladdin retellings are based off of, and the very base and like bones of Aladdin are there. Like they took some things and they left other things out completely, and so this is a very different story than a lot of the retellings, although it has like very similar elements at times, and I usually really like that. I usually really like seeing the classic tales that a lot of these retellings come from. This one I didn't love as much. It's definitely not my favorite classic fairy tale folktale thing that I've read. I just didn't love it that much. I thought it had its nice moments, but my intention wasn't captured. Things changed very quickly, and I wasn't completely sure how I was supposed to feel about Aladdin, even at the end, because it seems like Aladdin's role in the story shifted a lot, and I didn't love that, every element of that. So yeah, it was a 3-star. It was okay, it was fine. I'm glad I read it, but I didn't overly enjoy it, so I'm not gonna give it higher than a 3-star. Moving on. The next 2 things I read were 2 short little lays by Marie de France. Marie de France is this, I believe she's an author from the Middle Ages. She wrote in Anglo-Norman, which is this old English-French mixture. I don't know. I really know nothing about Anglo-Norman or languages or anything. And so if someone does, feel free to correct me. But like, I have no idea. Marie de France is this, we assume a woman, and we assume she's from France, but living in England. And so she was writing these little lays or narrative poems about the Arthurian knights, and she was writing Arthurian tales, and she was writing in lays, which are like these short narrative poems. Sometimes people translate them to look more like poems. This translation did not. They were basically just like stories, and they were pretty readable. They were very short. They were very interesting. They weren't my favorite Marie de France stuff. I've read some of her stuff in other classes, and I would personally recommend Sir Orfeo if you want to read some Marie de France. She retold the story of Orpheus, and I really liked that. Or maybe Chèvrefuit if you're interested in like a more Arthurian tale. That was my favorite Arthurian thing I've read by her. But the ones I read this time were Yonec and Lanval, and they're both pretty similar to each other. Her lays usually follow the knights of Arthurian court, or just a character in Arthurian times. And this character has an entanglement of some sort with a supernatural being. And that's generally how her lays go. These 2 were no exception. They were interesting. Lanval was about a Arthurian knight having this entanglement, and Yonec was very much like Rapunzel. And so they were interesting. I didn't really enjoy either of them a lot. I would give them both 3 stars. I really feel weird rating these really old things because like they're not really meant for me necessarily, but I'm rating them compared to the other Marie de France and like Arthurian romance stuff I've read. And so that's just based on my enjoyment. These things are clearly like some of the founding works of English literature, and I'm definitely still gonna give them 3 stars. And honestly, I would not recommend unless you're really interested in like the Arthurian myth and how people were propagating it, just because, I don't know, they're not like super accessible classics. Moving on, I read another Arthurian romance for the same class. All those were for the fantasy literature class that I'm taking. They're all like fantasy ancestors, I don't know. And so I read another fantasy ancestor, and that is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and this is the edition of Gawain that was translated by Tolkien. And so this was interesting. This is the second time I've read Gawain. I haven't read Tolkien's translation before now, but I have read it now. And it was interesting. I am not crazy about the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but I thought it was interesting to see what Tolkien changed and what he kept from other translations. Like it's interesting to see what the translator emphasizes about this story and like downplays, and so that was cool, I guess. But I find this epic, it's just like an epic poem, and I find it harder to read than someone like Marie de France. I find it just hard because it's very poemy and interested in descriptions of people and things, but not so much in action, and so you can blink and miss some like important stuff. So that's not fun, but you know, it's old, it's masterwork of English literature, I guess. I don't know what else to say about this. It's fine. I know people who genuinely really enjoy this, and if you're an Arthurian romance fan, then you will really like this. And by the way, when I'm saying Arthurian romance, I don't mean like there's a romance in it. I just mean that it's like a romantic hero journey story. Synopsis. Need a synopsis for this. This, I would say, is a epic poem about the adventures of an Arthurian knight named Sir Gawain. We basically see this green knight come into the court of Arthur on Christmas, and he challenges Arthur himself to a game of some sort. And the game is basically, he gives Arthur his axe, and he says to Arthur, if you can kill me, chop my head off, something, and win, if you can win the game, then you win, great. But if you lose, then I believe the terms are you will let me do whatever you did to me in a year. So Arthur does not accept the challenge, but Sir Gawain does. Sir Gawain is one of Arthur's knights, and he feels responsible to accept the challenge. And so we basically follow Gawain accepting this challenge, playing this game, and accepting the consequences of the game and rising to meet them. That's all I want to say about this and its plot. You can discover it for yourself. This is another one I don't really think is a super accessible classic, and I wouldn't recommend or talk about or read if I hadn't been an English major. But I'm happy to have read it and like experienced it. It's just, you know, not my thing. I don't know. Then the next thing I finished, the next classic I finished is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This is my third reread of Pride and Prejudice. I give it 5 stars on this reread. I loved it. So I'm in a class that is focusing on Pride and Prejudice and its many iterations, adaptations. And so of course we had to start with the original text, Pride and Prejudice itself. And I really enjoyed this reread a lot. When I first read Pride and Prejudice, I feel like I didn't understand it enough. I was really loving Emma, and so I didn't love Pride and Prejudice quite as much as Emma, and so I was kind of disappointed with it. The second time I read it, I enjoyed it a lot more, really liked it, but I still don't think I was getting the best experience of reading it, but this time was just such an amazing read-through of this story. I love this story. I know this story. I feel like I understand this story now. I understand these characters better now. I got so many new things from this reread, just a better understanding of Pride and Prejudice in general, and I'm really happy about that. I love that I can read this 3 times and still feel like there's more to learn, and also that I have understood the story a lot. I feel like on this reread, I also understood Jane Austen's prowess as a writer more. I was really interested in her plot and its intricacies, and its pacing was great. I was really into her plot and thought it was just so well written. And then her prose is always just a joy to read. It is so funny and witty and beautifully said and concise. Well, I don't know about concise, but she says what she needs to say. And I always feel like it's intentional. And I love that about Jane Austen's prose. I also love her characters. I feel like I understand her characters a lot more with this read through especially. I feel like before this reread, I didn't know Elizabeth or Mr. Darcy or the Bennets or any of the other characters in this book as well as I know them now. Most of the things I've noticed is honestly about their characters, and I've managed to whittle them down to a better picture, I guess. Jane Austen puts a lot of nuance to her characters, and it's very easy, I think, to take away some of that nuance in adaptations or in the way we think about them. I'm guilty of this myself. I don't think I understood the nuances of their characters until this read through, and I think that's one of the beauties of Jane Austen, is that she can write these really well-formed characters where if you just keep peeling back the layers, you'll find contradictions in their own selves, because humans are like that, or just new traits that you have to face. They're not perfect people, but they have flaws, and they're there in the book. Jane Austen does not write perfect characters. It's probably still my second favorite Jane Austen book, but I would have to reread Emma. This reread was just so bright and happy and lovely and fun. The romance is cute, as always, beautifully written, love it. Jane Austen herself had a criticism about this book, and it was that it was too bright. It was like it didn't have enough shadow or something, or it wants shadow is what she said, I think. Or so, wants shade. That's what she said. She said it wants shade in one of her letters. And I see what she means by that. And I'm very grateful to Pride and Prejudice's brightness. I think there's definitely criticisms to be had about this book and this author and things, but I love it. I hope that whenever I return to this book, it feels just as bright. And then the next classic that I picked up and finished was actually a classic that I picked up on my own volition. The other one that I read this month that is one that I picked up for fun is Fellowship, and that's not done. But the one I did finish that I picked up for my own volition is The Sign of the Four by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So this is like a mystery detective novella about Sherlock Holmes and his sidekick Watson, who basically just is in awe as Sherlock figures out mysteries with not enough information. And that's pretty much all you need to know about this. I don't really want to explain anything about the actual mystery in this book. I read The Sign of the Four, which is the second book in the series. I liked the mystery plot a lot better in this one than I did in A Study in Scarlet. I thought that the way A Study in Scarlet is written makes it a little bit jarring at times, but I thought that this took its time with the mystery, and I really enjoyed that, and I really enjoyed having more time seeing Sherlock figure it out and seeing Watson kind of try and catch up. I also really enjoyed Sherlock and Watson's characters. I thought their characterization was really good, and I feel like I know them really well, and so I do think I enjoyed this more than A Study in Scarlet. However, I do need to address, this is one of the books in the series that is accused of the most racism, and after reading it, I definitely feel like, as much as I can say so, that there is some very pernicious racism going on in this book. And I do think that the racism specifically found in The Sign of the Four is a part of a very long tradition with very real consequences for very real people. Devastating consequences. And I will be leaving links about why I think that the portrayal in this book is so pernicious and why I think that it is so important to talk about it and not just sweep it under the rug. I will be leaving links to explain that below. Basically, the way that certain people are described in this book is very racist and bad, and it just, that this thinking about this certain group had a lot of very devastating consequences, and I will be leaving links about that in the pinned comment and description. Trigger warning for some graphic violence, starvation, etc., colonization, racism, etc. Also human zoos. I don't know whether I should be that specific, but we're going to be talking about human zoos. That's why this book is so pernicious, because of how the ideas in here justify human zoos. And so if you don't know what those are, I will be leaving links. I highly recommend you check them out. Highly recommend you do some research about it, just so we can know what we're reading. That being said, I gave it a 4 stars because I enjoyed it so much, but also didn't enjoy it enough, and also the racism was very disturbing to me. Moving on, the next thing I read was for class, and that is Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe. Marlowe was a contemporary of Shakespeare. He was writing very different plays than Shakespeare. Dr. Faustus is a play about a man who is very smart. He's a scientist. He's too smart for his own good at times, and his overreaching intelligence gets him into a bad situation. And this bad situation is the fact that he has now started meddling with satanic powers and is getting involved with the devil. And you slowly watch his descent, which is very interesting, and how he gets in over his head way too quickly. I liked this because I felt like there was many ways to interpret his character and interpret the things he was doing. That was interesting. Marlowe leaves a lot open to interpretation, and I appreciate that. But Marlowe's language was a bit much for me. I couldn't really follow his language extremely well. I have an easier time with Shakespeare personally, but maybe that's just because I've read him more and so I'm more used to him. But I did struggle with Marlowe's prose, or I guess his writing a little bit. The ending was great though. I really liked the ending, and I think some of Marlowe's best writing is in the ending of that play. And you know, if you're interested in descent stories about, or like an imagining of hell, imagining of the devil, then you might like this play a lot. If you're someone who is interested or likes the Divine Comedy, Paradise Lost, this seems to be in that tradition of imagining hell or imagining the consequences for sins while you're living, then you might like this play. It's interesting, but it wasn't ultimately my favorite Renaissance play I've ever read. And so I gave it 3 stars. This is a better 3-star than the other 3 stars I've read though, because I really like that ending. And then the final thing I'm talking to you about is Little Red Riding Hood, which is the fairy tale by Charles Perrault, not the Grimm version, not Little Red Cap. This is the Perrault version, and it's quite different. So I was expecting, because the title is Little Red Riding Hood and not Little Red Cap, I was expecting this to be the story that I knew from when I was a kid. Like the exact, I thought Perrault's version was the one that is retold a lot. And maybe it is sometimes, but definitely the plot structure of the Grimms is definitely retold a lot more. It's just given different names and made easier to read, I think. But Perrault's version is a lot different. And I am going to talk about specifics as to why this is different from the story of Little Red Cap and the main version of Little Red Riding Hood that I've heard. So if you don't want to know why it's different, then I would exit out of this video now. Thank you for watching. If you do want to know, we're going to talk about it now. So this story ends after the wolf eats both the grandmother and then Little Red Riding Hood. And so we don't have that whole scene with the hunter, which is in the Grimm's version and most versions of Little Red Riding Hood that I've read, where the hunter cuts open the wolf and lets the grandmother and Little Red Riding Hood out of the stomach, and they survive, but the wolf dies. Yeah, there's no hunter in the story. No one saves them. They just are in his stomach and they die, and he wins, kind of, I guess. And then it ends with a short little poem about the dangers of wolves, warning children against the dangers of wolves, which are clearly not real wolves. This is the most explicit fairy tale that I've heard talk about child predators, and warning children against predatory people, I guess. You can take what this sort of predator is in multiple different ways, I think, but there's very explicitly a warning at the end. And so I felt this was a lot darker than the Grimm's version. Some of the Grimm's fairy tales are kind of gruesome, and some of them are definitely darker than this one, but this is a dark ending to me. And so I can kind of see why it's not the one that I read as a kid, or at least I don't think I read this as a kid, and if I did, I definitely didn't know what I was reading. But yeah, it was interesting. It was odd. I gave it 3 stars. It was a very enjoyable 3 stars because I love fairy tales, even though this one was really weird. And I do actually want to continue with Pro's work and see if this is just his style, like if he takes a lot of fairy tales and rewrites them and makes them more moral, or like makes the morals more explicit. I just want to see more of Pro's work. I don't know if this is like a one-off or whether he does this a lot, but he's one of the major fairy tale authors that I have not yet read, so that will be fun when I eventually get to him. Thank you for watching this classics wrap-up. These are some of the books that I read this month that are classics, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.